Welcome to the 363rd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome Adam Searle and Jonathan Turnbull to COVID calls to talk about their work on more than human perspectives on the pandemic. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID Calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. Today is a special COVID Calls at 5:30 p.m. Korea time. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, October 22nd, 2021, there are 4,929,170 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. This is the obituary of Cornelia Han Oberlander, which appeared in the New York Times. Cornelia Han Oberlander, a German born Canadian landscape architect who blended naturalistic designs with modernist ideals and recognized early on the urgency of climate change, designing public spaces to mitigate its effects, died on May 22nd in Vancouver, British Columbia. She was 99. The cause was complications of COVID-19, said her daughter, Judy Overlander. Overlander was one of the first women to study at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where she was taught by Walter Gropius, a leader of the Bauhaus movement. Its modernist ethos and her own upbringing gave her a mission to improve people's lives with public spaces nourished by nature. With the Canadian modernist architect Arthur Erickson, she created some of the most enduring and beloved public spaces in Vancouver, her adopted city. One is Robson Square, a 3-block downtown plaza built between 1978 and 1983. An oasis of green roofs, waterfalls, and hanging gardens, it descends from the city's courthouses and government offices, a low-slung concrete complex designed by Mr. Erickson by way of an ingenious series of gently graded granite stair ramps that Miss Oberlander called stramps. She was inspired by goat paths. They make each level navigable to anyone, even if you're in a wheelchair or pushing a pram. Long before the phrase climate change had entered the popular lexicon, Miss Oberlander was designing green roofs to cool cities and provide stormwater management. She worked globally with some of the 20th century's most celebrated architects, including Louis Kahn, Moshe Safdie, and Renzo Piano. She worked in particular with Mr. Piano on the new headquarters for the New York Times, a 52-story tower on Manhattan's West Side. His design called for an interior atrium in the shape of a perfect cube with a grid of birch trees, and it was Miss Oberlander's seemingly impossible task to make it happen. Cornelia brought science to the conversation, said Hank White, the landscape architect with whom she collaborated on the project. She called in a scientist who had created a software program to model microclimatology and asked him to measure the wind, sun, and shade patterns of this yet to be created space. In the end, on an undulating floor of hillocks and dales, the trees were placed not on a grid, but exactly where the light would fall. Cornelia Ann Hahn was born on June 20th, 1921, in Mulheim an der Ruhr, Germany, the oldest of 3 daughters in a wealthy and socially conscious family. Her father, Franz Hahn, was an engineer in the family's steel business, founded by a great-grandfather of Cornelia's, and later a management consultant. Her mother, Beate Jastrow Hahn, was a horticulturalist and children's book author. Cornelia grew up in Dusseldorf and Berlin. With the Nazis rising to power in the 1930s, Cornelia, like so many other Jewish children, was forbidden to attend her school. The family's passports were taken away, as was the steel business that was the source of their wealth. Their butler began to hide his own money under a rug for the family so that it might help them should they escape. They were finally able to flee in late 1938, 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, the Nazi pogrom against Jews, with the help of Geoffrey Lawrence, a British judge and family friend who would go on to oversee the Nuremberg trials. At Harvard's School of Design, she met Peter Oberlander, who was studying urban planning. Viennese born and also Jewish, Mr. Oberlander had ended up in Canada in 1940 after having been in a series of internment camps. Cornelia caught his eye at a student picnic, and so did the dessert she had brought, an Austrian Bundt style cake called a Gugelhupf. It was a place in time cake that sealed the deal, said their daughter, Wendy Oberlander, the kind of Madeleine that created an instant bond between the two young European refugees. The couple married in New York City in 1953 and moved to Vancouver, where Mr. Oberlander became a professor of city planning at the University of British Columbia. He died in 2008. Ms. Overlander was serious about children and their play, and worried particularly about urban children and their access to nature. Beginning with her early work in public housing in Philadelphia, she made sure to include places for children in her landscapes. The Philadelphia site prefigured Ms. Oberlander's design for her most famous work, a playground for Expo 67, the Montreal World's Fair. It's been described as a stage for children to express themselves on rather than an arrangement of equipment that told them what to do. In 2008, when Mr. Birnbaum of the Cultural Landscape Foundation flew out to Vancouver to interview Miss Oberlander for his oral history project, she gave him and his crew a tour of her property, a modernist house that cantilevers over a ravine. She and her husband had designed it with a friend, and a semi-wild landscape with fruit trees and flowers. As was her habit, Miss Oberlander, at 5'2", was marching along swiftly, and the film crew was struggling to keep up. When Mr. Birnbaum asked her to slow down, she told him, "When I was young, I was always the fastest. My mother said I had to slow down and let the Aryan children win. I swore I would never slow down again." The obituary of Cornelia Han Oberlander, which appeared in the New York Times. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today and let me introduce my guests to you. Jonathan Turnbull is a cultural and environmental geographer from the University of Cambridge. His PhD research, funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, concerns the return of nature to the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine, where he's been working for the last 2 years with scientists studying different aspects of the zone's ecology, especially dogs and wolves. Adam Searle is a cultural and environmental geographer from the University of Liège in Belgium. His PhD research at Cambridge examined de-extinction, or bringing back extinct animals to life, building upon ethnographic work in the Spanish and French Pyrenees, and his postdoctoral research funded by the European Research Council, which concerns the use of biotechnologies in agriculture. Jonathan Turnbull and Adam Searle, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, thanks for having us, and thank you very much for that obituary. It was very moving.
She was really something. I have to say, I was aware of her work, but I wasn't aware it was her, which maybe says something also about the problem of recognizing landscape architects, and particularly female landscape architects. But yeah, I was really taken by that story too. So I like to start the way I generally do, just find out where people are calling from and what the pandemic is looking like there. And Adam, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, so I'm calling from Barcelona now, where I've been based for the last 3.5 years. I came here for my PhD research, and then was kind of left here by the pandemic. But it was a very, I don't know, it was a very solidarity. There was a lot of solidarity here during the pandemic, and we really built a sense of community in the neighborhood. And I was quite grateful to have my neighborhood here during the pandemic. So
Spain got hit very hard early. What was it like in Barcelona in the worst of it?
During the worst of it, we weren't allowed outside at all, apart from to go to the shop once every few days. And every time you went to the shop, there was kind of police checks in every street corner, particularly where I live in the old town. It was, children weren't allowed outside for months. It was 2 months or so. We weren't allowed out to exercise or anything, and I don't know. I really missed the kind of daily, you know, walk. That I don't know. Other people in other countries kind of built into their rhythm this kind of light exercise. But we had to kind of make do with a square meter balcony.
Mm.
Yeah, it was quite it was it had to be done, the lockdown of that kind of severity, because the cases were so high and it was so terrifying. I guess it was very new, and it was one of the, I think after Italy, the second hit place in Europe, and it was all very very scary. So that's what had to be done. Um, but yeah, it was particularly until around June of 2020, it was very very scary. And then things got a little bit better, things opened up a little bit, and then it got worse again. Things closed down again, like everywhere else in Europe.
Mm.
But at the moment, it's looking kind of a lot better. I mean, we're still getting about 150 cases a day in Barcelona, but the curve is kind of on that flattening side of it now. Um, so yeah, we're still not out of it yet, and there's still people going through heartbreak every day. But there's more of an optimism around the way things are going.
Do you have a specific memory, Adam, of any point in the pandemic that really sticks with you? And I know I call this the impossible question because there's so many things sort of crammed together there. But is there something you can pull out that really adheres to COVID for you in your memory?
Yeah. Can I choose two? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
The first one was really around the kind of what I was just talking about, which was the first time I heard children playing, was when there was in Barcelona, I think in all of Catalonia, they children weren't allowed outside at all, so they weren't on the list of people that could go to the shops to get the essential food or anything. So there was really a long time. People don't have gardens here in the city, so people live in flats. And I don't know, it was really kind of a bizarre absence of the sound of children playing. And I live on a kind of pedestrianised street in the old city. And there was a period of, I think, 2 weeks where the government said, okay, children should be allowed to play. So there was 1 hour a day where only children were allowed outside. So I think under 16s were allowed to play outside. And there was just this, I don't know, it was a joyous sound of just hearing people playing, kicking a ball about on the street and things like that. And that for me was like the first sign of hope. I remember kind of feeling very emotional at that sound. The second one for me was something which really just kind of got me through it, in terms of just finding something to tune into and finding something to focus on every day. Particularly as we weren't allowed outside at all, and I'm someone who really likes to spend a lot of time looking at wildlife, likes to spend a lot of time in kind of protected areas, or I don't know, protected areas not the right thing, but amongst kind of wild areas, and going to particularly observing birds, and cycling and things like that, and getting out in the hills. And for me it was really it really sucked a lot of energy out of me, not being able to see the comings and goings of animals, or birds. And not, I mean, I could hear the bird song from my balcony, but I couldn't see anything. And there was really I saw this news article on BBC Radio Sheffield, talking about the fact that internet traffic to these peregrine falcon webcams had gone up by 800%. And I checked out the webcam and ended up just kind of really fixated on watching the kind of intimate lives of these peregrine falcons in the middle of a city which I know really well and grew up going. All my family's from South Yorkshire, and I don't know. I suddenly just got so much hope watching the birth of the peregrine chicks, the fledging, the everything, just the life cycle of these kind of magnificent animals that have managed to adapt to cities in the UK. That Yeah, so that for me was really something. It was like every day I'd wake up and I'd watch the sun rise in Sheffield and the plumes of smoke coming up from the chimneys, and a peregrine observe the sunrise, and that was really something that was important to me.
I mean, thank you for both of those, and they're both so specific, and I can imagine them both very clearly. I didn't check on those birds. There were other birds I was watching, but just to clarify, you could have watched those peregrine falcons anytime, right? Before the
Yeah,
pandemic? It's the pandemic when you found them, or they found you, however you want to think about it.
yeah, very much
That's
so. I'd
yeah,
I, I'd always go and look for them in cities. I'd very much like I was living in Cambridge when there was peregrine falcons coming over certain buildings in the city, and there was a lot of buzz around where the peregrines were going to nest, and a lot of excitement about whether it would be in this iconic building or this
yeah,
iconic
yeah.
building, and it was all very exciting. But and I'd go out and try and make an effort to see the peregrines, but I'd never thought that I could have a meaningful engagement, or get something from watching a webcam before, and I really did.
Jonathan, let me bring you in on this. Same questions. Where are you calling from now? How's the pandemic looking? And also, if you wouldn't mind sharing a memory or two, as much as you want, that really sticks for you in the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm in The Hague now in the Netherlands, and I've come here from Kiev, Ukraine, where I was based for the entirety of the pandemic. Um, so I don't know too much about the state of the pandemic here, but I can tell you my reflections on kind of how it feels different to where I was before, because Ukraine didn't really have as tight of a lockdown as other places. Certainly not the UK. We were in kind of a controlled lockdown for only a few months, I think, and it felt like in public places everyone was, wearing masks and being very sensible, and it was quite a shock to come to the Netherlands via the UK, where people definitely seem to be more relaxed about it, less mask wearing, um, probably explained by the higher vaccination rates, but. Um, Yeah, I thought it was actually going to be more relaxed in Ukraine, but it was vice versa. So it's a bit of a shock, yeah, to go into supermarkets and stuff where no one, including the staff, are wearing masks. So um, I guess that tells you something about how people are, experiencing it now and treating the pandemic. But I guess a memory or a reflection from the early pandemic when it started, I guess, which is when a lot of the strong memories formed for both of us. I think it was kind of that camaraderie of being locked down originally with my partner and our friend who came to stay in our apartment. And it was just this feeling of like um, closeness and togetherness that I think a lot of people experienced because of the slowing down and this kind of enclosure. And I guess I was lucky enough to be, with two people I loved, and other people around the world were locked down in, more precarious situations. But I think for those people who experienced this kind of camaraderie, it was a quite like a homely, warming event. It was quite cozy in a weird way, despite what was going on outside. And I think that's kind of related to this trend that we're seeing in various places where um, people are kind of not really looking forward to going back to normal in some ways. And we're seeing kind of, in London, 60% of office workers just want to stay at home. So we're seeing these changes, which is what we've become kind of academically interested in. But then, kind of relating to this work that we've been doing, there was a couple of things that stood out, and the first was really the first time I went to the shop during lockdown, and I live in the center of Kiev in a district called Podil, which is also the old town, and it was completely empty, and it was bizarre, uh, and walking through these streets and completely um, kind of reinterpreting them as spaces that are empty of human life, and seeing them anew for this space that can be um, reused by other species. That sort of really came to mind because I was already aware of some of the news articles going around about dolphins in Venice and stuff like this. And then one of the second memories that is strong is actually Adam and I were speaking a lot during the pandemic using Skype, both like work calls and personal calls and stuff like this. And we were in a call with our supervisor from Cambridge, Bill Adams, and we were talking about, these news stories around animals reclaiming cities, or how it was being framed in the press. And one of the things, one thing that happened was, I can't remember exactly which direction it went, but I think a bird tweeted in Barcelona where Adam was, and the sound of the bird like came through on my computer into Kiev, and also Bill heard it in Cambridge as well. And this was just kind of this like amazing moment where like we kind of all experienced the bird at the same time. And this really got us thinking about like sort of how people were tuning into nature digitally during the pandemic as well, and whether there were any positives to this. Yeah, so I guess that's my two reflections.
Again, thank you for both of those. And I would just share with you, maybe we have the makings of an article here. One of the earlier COVID calls I did, I guess it was in early June of 2020. I was interviewing, I did a whole series of calls with staff of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, which is one of the oldest sort of natural history museums in the United States, and it's the oldest. And this particular one, and we were talking about this topic, although we didn't call it anthropause. I don't think that term was in circulation yet, but we were talking about this sort of general concept. And there was an ornithologist on the call, and of course it was June. I was living in Princeton, New Jersey at that time. I had the window open, and the ornithologist said, "Hey Scott, hold on a second. You've got and he identified the bird. He said, "You got some kind of a woodpecker." He said, "Be quiet a second." And he was listening, and he identified the bird in the tree, and it was such an unexpected moment, and yet so perfect of that time, because I also remember, and this is the juxtaposition of the terror, but also the tranquility, this sort of enhanced tranquility of hearing just a lot more birds because there was a lot less traffic. And I don't think there were more birds. There was just less traffic noise. And the fact that he could, from 50 miles away, identify this bird for me in my tree in my yard was just stunning. So maybe we should collect. Maybe you guys are already collecting these stories. You probably are. So add mine to the list, and count me among those interested in seeing where that goes. So we have a lot to talk about here. I want to remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Jonathan Turnbull and Adam Searle today about non-humans and the interaction of humans and nature in the pandemic. And so we'll come to many of the different things you've written, but I want to start by just getting this concept anthropause out on the table. It's one that you've worked a lot with, and it's actually one that I've talked about with guests on COVID Calls. Most recently, people will remember I talked to Korean artist Yi Kang, who's created really fascinating work based on anthropause. So, Adam, let me start with you, and then Jonathan, to you. Just a kind of in a general sense, what does the concept mean, and why were you drawn to it?
Thanks, Scott. So the concept is a word that was introduced by Christian Rutz, who's a conservation biologist, ecologist at St Andrews University, and a lot like a big team of co-authors who were writing around wildlife activity during the pandemic. I think it was in June 2020 that they published an article in Nature that Nature went with for the cover, and they offered a kind of etymology of the word. I guess really briefly, anthro from humans, pause, a stop. So they were using it to define a significant reduction in human activity and mobility during this time. So particularly looking at reduction in industry, which causes environmental stress, and in travel, from how travel affects the mobilities of non-humans and their activity too. So they wrote this article in Nature that we thought was really interesting, because they were presenting this as a kind of novel opportunity to study wildlife from this kind of baseline level that was absent. I mean, it was really a kind of unprecedented opportunity. They were presenting it as an unprecedented opportunity to understand the world without humans. But what we were interested in with this really was understanding it slightly more critically from a social sciences perspective, asking, well, who has the ability to pause? How is this anthropause unevenly experienced across various lines of socioeconomic differences that are really kind of shaping, who had the ability to pause? People who worked in so-called essential jobs, those working in logistics and healthcare, in many different forms of jobs, weren't able to pause, and actually their life intensified very much so. And we were interested in kind of understanding how the anthropause could be understood from a more kind of multiple perspective. So I'll stop rambling now, but I'll let you.
Jonathan, just to pick up on that, any aspect of it, and I'm particularly interested, especially in light of your work, in previous examples where this term might have been applicable.
Yeah, that's probably the only thing I'd add to what Adam said, was that we tried to, with our colleague Jamie Lorimer, we tried to understand the anthropause as a multiple thing that has instances of it's occurred before in different for different reasons. So my research at Chernobyl, we might see things like disaster events or pollution events like Chernobyl, Fukushima, the Trinity test site, things like this. Often they're three radioactive ones, but we'll find others like oil and gas disasters and things like this, where exclusion zones and no man's lands are created. We can see these as a kind of a slowing down of certain activities, but a ramping up of other ones in certain areas that have ecological impacts. We also we came up with this typology, and on the typology there was other causal agents for anthropause events, such as pandemic events are one. So looking at through history, there's been influenzas and other pandemics that have also caused a global maybe not a global slowing down, but localized slowing downs of human activity that would have led to ecological changes. But I'm not sure if people were kind of, keeping track of what was going on there. And I think kind of the other thing that we tried to do was to distinguish between anthropause as like an event, or like a kind of way of labeling these periods of time in which ecological changes might be noticed, and also anthropause as a verb, as a practice of who was slowing down, where and why, and trying to kind of, as Adam said, unpack how it was experienced unequally.
Just to stay with that, Jonathan, for a second. I mean, there's so many angles on this. I mean, one of them is what did you, in some of your writing on this, what were you tracking in terms of humans noticing animals during the anthropause? So just coming back to what we were just talking about here with the birds, I mean, this became a global phenomena of observation. And so you were watching that a little bit. What kind of trends did you notice in that? And we've got Adam with his peregrine falcons, and we've got me with the birds in the yard, and then a lot of anecdotal stuff. Everybody I talked to seemed to have some story of seeing animals all of a sudden. Why that, and what were you paying attention to particularly with that?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, because it speaks to some work that we've just finished as well. So the peregrine falcons was what really drew us both in. To be honest, we were both kind of sucked into this one camera, the Sheffield one that Adam mentioned, and that quickly spiraled into looking at as many of the peregrine falcon cams in the UK as possible. And we think we've managed to produce a good map of where they are, and get some records on how people tuning into them had differed during the pandemic compared to before. But I think what we wanted to do was to try and amalgamate all of these stories, and use the word anecdotal. And it seemed to be anecdotal. It seemed to be everyone had this kind of story about, peering out the back garden and seeing wildlife, and kind of attuning to it in a way that they never had before, or putting up a bird box for the first time, or a bird bath, or a bird feeder, often birds. And that's kind of anticipating one of your later questions, but we got really involved with the Self-Isolating Bird Club, and ended up speaking to a lot of their members. But I think what we wanted to do was to try and give some empirical weight to some of the speculation that had been going on in academic writing and popular writing around, how the anthropause had really changed people's relationships with nature in various ways. And we wanted to explore the ways in which that actually happened. So we did these quite big surveys, and then ran a number of focus groups with which focused around the Self-Isolating Bird Club, which we can come to later, to really ask people in detail what was going on. And I think what we identified as some of the key changes were that the slowing down allowed people to kind of inhabit these new temporal rhythms, and often this meant getting outside at a time when getting outside was limited, and really paying attention to what was around them. So a lot of people started using apps like iBird and things like this to learn more about the wildlife in the back gardens, and see what was there, and compare it to friends and other people. People took active actions to kind of bring wildlife to their back gardens or balconies, or whatever was available. So plants on balconies, growing things for the first time. Like, lots of people did turn to this, according to our survey. Other things like hedgehog houses or hedgehog hotels, this kind of thing. People installed them in the gardens to attract wildlife. So we kind of saw this as a cultivation, an attempt at cultivating wildlife during this time. And then the last big theme that we kind of identified was that people were using digital technologies in new ways. So bird bath sales went through the roof during the pandemic as people tried to get birds into their garden, but so did things like trap cams or trail cameras, which are motion activated cameras that you put in your back garden or local green space to see what's there when you're not there. And like, lots of people, including scientists who often did field research abroad, started to use their own equipment, or use this equipment for the first time, to identify what was going on in their back gardens and stuff like this. So I think those are some of the main things that we identified.
Adam, just to bring you in, anything Jonathan's talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, this is the work we've all been doing here. That's been kind of ethnographic work with people who are involved in the Self-Isolating Bird Club. And what we were kind of trying to do with this was to challenge this idea that the kind of nature automatically will get better in the absence of humans, and really kind of critique this idea that this has been a good thing for wildlife, and not find optimism in this kind of politically neutral idea that we step back and nature will get better, which we think kind of allows for a very negative politics around the environmental crisis that's currently going on. And rather, we were thinking about it as, well, if we are going to find some affirmative cause for optimism here, it's actually looking at the very concrete actions that many people have taken around the world to engage more meaningfully with nature and find more kind of opportunities for conviviality with other species during this time. And that's something that we've really been able to focus on with this project. That's been interesting.
I just want to ask a couple of questions, just since you collected this amazing data and just some of your thoughts about it. Adam, let me just stay with you first on this. That at a moment of maximum tension, fear, people worried about their families, their jobs, and then also political tension, both in the UK, in the United States, and Brazil, India, many other places in the world, with political leadership showed itself to be incompetent, criminal. Some sort of engagement with nature, people reported that as a stress relief. I mean, what do we find in that engagement? Is it a way to fill time, to get off the screen? I don't think we have to maybe choose one of these, but I'm really curious about that. And I mean, there's a lot of psychological literature out there that says people keep pets in general as stress relief. So is this in some way an extension of that? Just with more time, people want to be closer to animals, or they want to be in settings where they're going to run into multiple species and not humans. I mean, that's maybe one way to interpret this, but maybe you encountered other sort of possible interpretations of this.
Yeah, very much so. This was really a really common theme in all of our focus groups and our survey responses, was that people were really turning to nature as an escape mechanism. Really, that phrase came up a lot. That this is an escape from the horrors of what's going on. People were losing loved ones. People were terrified about what they were going to eat next week. It was just awful, and so much more awful for many, like I don't know, but many people didn't have the opportunity to even think about nature. So it was a very privileged thing to even begin to think about nature as an escape mechanism. But those who did, it was always something that was, I don't know, it was this thing came up so much around. This was a means of seeing life going on, that all around was stories of horror and stories of death, and particularly. I mean, we've not done work in the Southern Hemisphere, but in the Northern Hemisphere, the outbreak of the pandemic came at springtime, and this is something which came up a lot, that people felt really attuned to the seasons for the first time ever in their lives. This came up so much that, you know, there was all around was death, but then you could see the leaves grow on the trees for the first time in months. You saw, you know, birds in the garden for the first time, and there was this real kind of, okay, well, things will go on. And yeah, I mean, there is a huge literature in environmental psychology on this, on the need to engage with nature to cope, really. But it was something which was really prominent in our research. And also on the other side of that as well was this use of nature as a community building tool. And this was something as well that wasn't just people going and you know, spending time with birds. It was also people thinking around birds or thinking around conservation or wildlife, and using that to create connections and the kind of mutual community with humans as well. And a lot of people found that this was a real opportunity to meet their neighbors for the first time, to talk around this sort of thing. That this was, and particularly we saw this online quite a lot, was this community building opportunity that really kind of united a lot of people. And there was this kind of common element, which was, okay, well, we're all observing wildlife at the moment, that brought a lot of people together that probably wouldn't have been brought together before. And that was something that we saw play out online quite a lot.
And yet, Jonathan, I sense there's a bit of an ambivalence in your analysis in this too, because you know, the question of who gets to pause, right? So we're talking about a very specific sort of segment of the society in different countries that's not also having to go in the clinic and save lives every day, or take out the trash, or whatever they're having to do. So that's part of it. But then also, and I've wrestled with this personally, that treating nature as something that's just there to be engaged with when you're ready to, on your own terms, without being aware that the pause it is so as you said, it's focused on the human experience of the pause, and not being aware about how putting more people in the trail, more people in the park, might actually be having a negative impact on wildlife. So as humans draw off the strength or their own, you know, need to bring their stress down by being in natural settings, they might actually be unpausing for other species in that space. I'm not saying it very well because I think it's a complicated idea, but maybe you can help me a little bit.
Yeah, no, I really understand what you're saying, and people are kind of anticipating the end of the anthropause and the kind of coming surge of human activity. And this is something that, again, we're really interested in, is trying to trace how any of these benefits that people purportedly had during the pandemic, whether they might have lasting effects. So will this kind of new knowledge gained around wildlife through the use of apps, through community building, as Adam said, through spending more time outside and slowing down, how long will that last? Will there be a legacy, or will it just go, you know, things open up again, boom? And things aren't opening up overnight. Things are coming through slowly, which suggests there might be an opportunity to preserve some of these kind of things, which, as I said earlier about in London, I think I heard the other day, there's a statistic around 60% of people are kind of resistant to going back to the office. And it's kind of, I think there's been some changes now, because it's been so long, that there are things that have the opportunity to be preserved. But there's others who are doing research on this, who are trying to do a longitudinal study, which we're attempting to as well with our focus group participants, to really follow up with them and say, okay, so last year you told us this. How do these practices? Are you still involved in these practices? Is this something that Have they changed? Have they become stronger or lesser?
Mm.
So yeah, I think there's been opportunities for that legacy to continue, but we can't really say yet whether that's happening or happened.
Jonathan, let me stay with you for a second on this too, because I wanted to ask you about Chernobyl and the memory that you shared earlier. And I had I've never been to Pripyat, but been in Fukushima and um, but then even also in Princeton, New Jersey, in the middle of this, and taking walks at night, and then literally it's empty. And my mind just went. This is just me, but my mind went to this first. Like I'm in a city where a nuclear attack has occurred somehow close by. You know, it for me, it enacted like studies I had read
Mm,
of what the United States nuclear war planners said it would be like, which is that everybody would be sheltered.
hmm
And so the town hadn't been destroyed, but it was unsafe.
hmm
And so it's the flip side of what we've been talking about with the anthropause and the rush to nature to find some sort of solidarity and comfort, but it's the fear of the absence of humans, another piece of that. I just wanted to get you to reflect on that a little bit, and even if you found it in the data that there was another sort of subgroup of people that picked up on that, or just what you thought. And here's I wanted just to add one more piece of this because you're describing being in Kiev, which, if I understand it right, I mean, if things had gone even worse at Chernobyl, that would have been the reality of Kiev.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the first part, I would say, I don't really recall from the focus groups or surveys a sense of people reflecting in a similar way to what you mentioned there. But I definitely think that there was a kind of eeriness for some people about this. There was an eeriness to kind of spaces with which they were very familiar due to this kind of absent, the absence of life going on, which kind of really reconfigured what very familiar places were and allowed people not only to see them as wild spaces, but to reimagine them in different ways. And I think so, like, during the pandemic, there was the biggest wildfire that there's ever been in Chernobyl. And the smoke from those fires blew and drifted over Kiev. And so the whole city was completely covered in this huge, dusty smog. And this was at a time during the pandemic where people weren't locked down, so people were able to go outside, but it brought people back inside again, and it was really engulfed for a few days, like incredibly thick. So when you went to the shops and you'd breathe, you'd really feel it, and you could smell it everywhere. And there was this kind of pervading sense that the air is radioactive again, and it kind of reignited these kind of, oh, that's what it must have been like in 1986. And if it were not for the efforts that were put in at the time, the space would have been much larger, and it could have encompassed like much more of Ukraine and other countries in Europe like Belarus. But I think that the comparison that we've been interested in is these stories of resurgence that are kind of, as Adam said, politically neutral, that just make it seem as if humans can do what they want to the environment, and nature will just bounce back the same as it was before. This kind of ahistorical view of nature as this thing that is always kind of trying to get back to the Pleistocene, or a place in which you've got like megafauna running everywhere and this kind of thing. And so at Chernobyl, I'm really interested in contesting that idea of nature bouncing back, not in a way that discredits kind of the really excellent field science that's going on there, that is finding the presence of species like the first brown bear that's been there in over 100 years in the region, but rather to kind of complicate it and say, okay, you have the presence of these animals, but if you look at finer scales and you look at microbial diversity and stuff like this, there are impacts, and I'm trying to kind of like unpack these impacts without getting fully politicized myself, if that's possible. I know that's not possible, but trying to see both sides of a story of resurgence, where one side kind of sees it as a totally positive thing, the other side sees it as a very negative thing, but trying to see where they're speaking at cross purposes and understand kind of resurgence in more grounded detail, rather than this just automatic process that nature will just do when we leave it alone.
Resurgence is such a powerful concept for these times too, because if we think about it in terms of SARS-CoV-2, that country by country, the infection rates tell us a story of the virus surging. And so if we're tracking everything that's going on, both human and non-human, it can bring a lot of different things into the story here and sort of decenter humans a little bit. I mean, I guess in the sense I'm talking about telling the pandemic from the perspective of the virus. We're thinking about sort of population growths and declines throughout this entire period. And I think it's provocative on the sort of values that maybe we leave unexamined in all of this, which I think what we've been talking about is that human life comes first, other life comes second, other life supports human life, and everything else has to follow from that. I just want to I want to read a quote from one of your articles that you published on the resurgence, and the title is More Than Human Perspectives on COVID-19. It's Resurgent Natures, More Than Human Perspectives on COVID-19. And this appeared in Dialogues in Human Geography. I'm going to read a couple sentences of it because it's. I'm going to point out two things. One is that a lot of times when you read articles that are co-authored, you can tell where one person's voice leaves off and another picks up. I can't tell. You guys are a great writing team because the tone is the same, and these are beautifully written articles. And let me just give you a sense of it for everybody who's listening. You said, when we talk about nature healing or resurging, what is it we really mean? The story of return, but to what? Restoration unavoidably requires particular reference to ecologies of the past, yet the abilities of particular ecologies to persist is a political and ethical matter, dependent on the ways we identify, respond to, and cultivate specific ecological milieus. Adam, just to, if you want to extend on anything Jonathan was talking about, or give us your sense of this resurgence concept and how you see it playing out.
Yeah, so we developed this idea from the work of anthropologist Anna Singh, and she writes around what she calls Anthropocene proliferation. And in response to this, resurgence is a something which is a kind of more than human endeavor. So it's something which we have to work for. So we were really troubling this idea that, I mean, this idea that it all came around from this kind of spectacular imagery that seemed to really proliferate around the world. And maybe it tied into this very particular cultural moment of needing something to feel good about. That these stories got kind of overblown a little bit as well. So there was one in Barcelona that was really quite memorable, which was a wild boar going down the main street, Diagonal, and kind of there was really a video of it waiting at a red light that was quite amusing for a lot of people. And anyone who knows Barcelona or many big cities in the kind of southern Europe, like Rome, there's a real problem. There's wild boar in the middle of the city all the time. I mean, literally a few weeks ago, Shakira was attacked by a wild boar in Barcelona. It's something that is very prominent. There was headline news here. But we were really kind of, sorry, that's a bit of a tangent to your question. What we were really kind of interested in was questioning this idea that nature had this kind of inherent ability to resurge, as Johnny said, and really say, well, no, if you look at these little stories everywhere, resurgence is something which is worked for, by both humans and non-humans alike. And as all the stories we've collected with the self-isolating bird club and the ethnographic work we've done over the last year has kind of shown, actually, there isn't this inherent resurgence in many cases. Actually, what's happening is people are really working to create these kind of opportunities for livability in the future. Real concrete actions of conservation that are politically charged and ethically charged.
You both have mentioned a couple times, and I should give you a chance to talk about, Adam, let me stay with you on this, the self-isolating bird club. Tell us about this group.
Yeah, so this group was set up by a really famous naturalist called Chris Packham and Megan McCormick, two really famous naturalists in the UK who are both really involved in broadcasting, who are hosts on a very popular TV show that's on the BBC called Spring Watch. Now there's also Autumn Watch and Winter Watch. I don't think there's a Summer Watch, but it's been an institution for a few decades in the UK. This show which charts the emergence of spring through wildlife footage around the UK, and it's it's a nice wholesome show. And so Chris Packham and Megan McCubbin were both broadcasters who then, broadcasting stopped, so they decided to kind of set up their own approach to broadcasting. And that, so Chris Packham, who's quite a kind of internet figure, quite a well-known personality in the UK conservation scene, because he's always has these, I don't know, he's great. He's got a really good view on nature and conservation, and he really politicizes it in a way that I think the older broadcasters around nature in the UK don't. They won't call out people on the extinction crisis and think that BBC should be there to provide a kind of politically neutral, hopeful story of nature. But Chris Packham will really call out practices that are wrong and things like that. And he's great. And so Chris Packham, I think it was on Facebook Live, the first one. And it was just set up. I mean, people really thought, going back to that time when lockdowns first came in, people really thought that this would last, 2 weeks. I mean, epidemiologists weren't saying that, but there was a kind of cultural idea that this would be over quite soon. So it was set up very much just quickly out of nowhere, and it was on Facebook Live, the first broadcast, and it was filmed on a mobile phone that was a bit shaky. There was no production value to it whatsoever. It was just off the cuff and really genuine and really wholesome. And it was Chris Packham being very honest around his anxieties around the pandemic, and his worries around loss of life, and talking about really openly around people in his family who were high risk and having to self-isolate, and things that were really kind of anxiety inducing. And there's a point in this broadcast where he says, well, how am I going to cope? How am I going to cope? How are any of us going to cope with any of this stuff? This is terrifying. And he says, oh, I know what I'm going to have to do. And then he stops and pauses, and then you just hear these robins, and he says, I'll be listening to those robins, the little garden birds. And it was this really sweet thing. And he basically created this internet community. And then later with Megan McCubbin in the broadcasts, where they started doing these daily broadcasts every day that thousands of people were tuning into. I mean, these were people that probably were watching things like Spring Watch anyway before, but actually in our focus groups and our surveys, a lot of people weren't really engaged with this stuff before. A lot of people were, we've got loads of stories of people saying, well, I've heard that nature can be really helpful this time, and I was really anxious, so I thought I'd give it a go, and then I got hooked on it and I stayed with it. So it was these daily broadcasts, and they were brilliant. Particularly after a few months, their kind of production level increased a little bit, but it stayed just as genuine and just as unscripted and just brilliant. And they'd have guests in from all over, talking about their relationship with nature and sharing their stories, and it was all just very genuine and relatable for a lot of people. And and what happened as a result of these broadcasts was this internet community that was born out of the audience of it. That there was really an idea that this is a shared thing, not just an audience, but rather a community. And I guess that was aided by digital technologies and Web 2.0, and this idea that it was something that was co-produced by the people engaging with it and the people producing the material. So particularly the Facebook group had, at the height of the pandemic, over 50,000 members, and it was really just a constant stream of people's images from their garden and from the garden, from their local wild spaces, things like that. And it was really this kind of shared resource of, we're all in this together. Let's share. Let's learn from each other and things like that. And then I don't know, for me particularly, I didn't have a garden to go to, and actually the evidence has showed, all the research has showed that for the majority of people in the UK and in Ireland, access to green space decreased, and a lot of people didn't have any access at all. So for a lot of people who weren't able to have a garden, I mean, so many people don't have a garden. I don't have a garden, and don't have access to local green space. Particularly, we spoke to a lot of people in our research participants who are in a kind of high risk category with chronic illnesses or with mobility issues and things like that, where there's real barriers to accessing nature. This was a way of kind of breaking down those barriers for a lot of people. Was a means of creating this shared resource, this kind of commons of nature.
That's fascinating, and it picks up on what we were talking about, I guess, for people, as you said, who couldn't go out because they were in a hard lockdown or they had no green space to go to. Then they brought it inside. Has the program continued, or it ran its lifespan and it's done now?
Yeah, actually, the program has stopped, and the Facebook group is now closed as well.
Interesting.
It's been archived, but there's been a kind of legacy group. I think it's called Friends of the Self-Isolating Bird Club, and it's still continuing. And a lot of people have made real friendships, real relationships with people they've met online there. Particularly, me and Johnny are currently supervising undergraduate dissertation from someone called Naomi Parker, and she's doing really amazing work with people who've been working in the Self-Isolating Bird Club. Her work's has shown so many kind of important insights from the legacy of this from a social perspective. Particularly, she's been looking at the experience of women in the Self-Isolating Bird Club, and she's found that she's run a lot of focus groups of people with women who felt we felt completely excluded from wildlife spaces in the past, in bird hides, being looked at by men and in a kind of judgy way that this isn't a space for women, things like that. And what Naomi's found is that particularly the women's experience of the Self-Isolating Bird Club has allowed these spaces to feel inclusive for the first time for many people. And so the legacy of this has been the kind of formation of lots of small groups around the country that have made wildlife more accessible, because access to wildlife is completely gendered and classed, and there's a huge barrier in terms of racial diversity in the UK, particularly around access to nature. And yeah, that's something that Naomi's been focusing on lately. It's really important work.
I just want to remind everyone you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Adam Searle and Jonathan Turnbull today. There's a couple other questions I'd like to get to if we can. And Jonathan, I want to ask you sort of another layer on this, which has to do with what's come to be called lab leak theory, and just, I mean, it's just, in a broader sense, it's the story of zoonosis and trying to find patient zero for SARS-CoV-2 in the United States. This has been weaponized by conspiracy theorists and people on the right who want to find a source for the disaster. They particularly want to find it in China. They want to find it in certain ideas about unhealthy relationships between humans and bats in China. So it's, in many ways, it's through the looking glass. It's the inverse of a lot of the things we've been talking about up to now. And it flips the script and talks about zoonosis as a danger, as a threat, and that humans can also accelerate that process through gain of function research, and they can pull from the natural world and create weapons. I wonder how you think about that problem and that sort of discourse around this. And I ask this also because I just had earlier this week has been a great one for these kinds of discussions. I had the anthropologist Frederick Keck on, and we talked about his work about bird watchers in China and Taiwan, and birds as sentinels, as sort of like warning bells of, some dangers coming. Just to get your sense of it, Jonathan. What do you think about those ideas?
Yeah, I think Frederick Keck's work's excellent on sentinels, and it's very much interested in his work in relation to Chernobyl as well, where different animals become sentinels for environmental change. But on the lab leak theory stuff, I think you were saying that people want to pin it to a certain point, to certain relationships that are deemed to be bad because they're different to the ones that are largely Western. And I think, that it's riddled with xenophobia, and it's riddled with an anti-Chinese sentiment. And honestly, I think I would have to point to the work of other anthropologists, like people like Eben Kirksey, who've done a lot of work on this, or I think Tom Van Doren was writing about the origins of the pandemic early on in terms of pangolins and bats and stuff like this, and the kind of multi-species relationships that are, deemed to be, allowable or not allowable by different communities. And I think it's just quite far away from what we've been thinking about that. It's like we've been interested in the effects of this pause on human-animal relationships and human-wildlife relationships in terms of resurgence. And we have been reading and influenced by the work that kind of looks at how human viral relationships have been reconfigured, how people's relationships with, like public spaces has been reconfigured. The work of people like Deborah Dixon there is incredibly interesting on stuff like this. But I don't think I've got too much to add, unfortunately, on the lab leak theory. I don't feel kind of qualified to say anything that's of interest, really.
No, I appreciate you just even engaging with it at all, because there's also this sort of contradiction, sort of unexpected, aspect of this, as we were discussing earlier, that those who now want to go out into nature. So on the one hand, we've got this sort of like fear of zoonosis, that it's an unhealthy relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Humans are too close to animals, and this is what's caused this disaster in the first place. Of course, that's in China. It's orientalized. It's made dangerous because it's another part of the world. But of course, in many parts of the world, the exact thing that's happening is people are going out into the wild and looking for interactions with birds, right? So
yeah,
there's something there that I'm still sort of trying to get my mind around. And I think you put your finger on it, which is that it's wrapped up in other ideas which have to do with exoticizing. Some people's relationships with animals are exotic, and other people's are healthy.
Yeah.
And I think that may be at the root of it.
And I think also what they have in common is that these relationships have been made global very quickly. And that's why this anthropause, in comparison to other ones, which, started because of pollution events or intentional creation of wildlife zones or economic disasters that all cause temporary slowing downs of human activity. This one was global immediately. And kind of that global slowing down was because of a global spread of a virus. And so I think it just meant that it really emphasized the kind of ways in which modern society is connected now. Mm-hmm. So imagine if it did originate in a market in China, and suddenly everyone, pretty much everywhere in the world, is feeling impacts of those interactions. And I also think I don't necessarily see the use in really determining exactly where the leak happened and why, but rather see it as a kind of to see the broader picture and the broader processes that were going on. So to see the virus originating in China is to ignore the kind of economic relations that China is and China encompasses, which is completely tied into a global economy and the global flow of capital. And so to see it as, coming from one place where, hopefully one person bought one animal that, gave the virus to the world, it seems unfair, and it seems rooted in, as we said, this anti-Chinese sentiment, this kind of othering of practices such as animals that you can or can't eat, whether you think animals are edible at all. It comes into all of these questions where we need to see it as a much broader picture, where your choices on the other side of the planet clearly now affect other people's lives elsewhere. And so, I think that's what we're seeing, is this real interconnectivity.
The other thing it makes me think of is that, people who've gotten really fascinated by that. I mean, I think there are maybe real biosecurity issues that people are going to look at that, and that's maybe important in the way this kind of research may be done. But, try to explain to someone who needs to be intubated and they can't get a machine in the United States because of disinvestment in the health system, that the real question they should be worried about is zoonosis in China. I mean, I think it's, again, it's to focus on this one thing and to the exclusion of the structural discussions, which are very much in front of us with all of this. I want to just return, we're almost out of time. I just want to return back to, your article after the Anthropause, Lockdown Lessons for More Than Human Geographies, and this appeared in the Geographical Journal. And Adam, I'm gonna read this and just give you both a chance to comment on this. It's kind of bringing us full circle in a sense, but again, so beautifully written. You said, like pausing a film, the experience of the realities we inhabit are put on hold. This is the Anthropause. To inhabit a pause involves a sense of being in the middle of things, at a turning point in a moment or a series of moments of uncertainty. As such, you write, pauses offer the chance for reflection. Equally, a pause is a disruptive, piercing event, engendering distinctions of before and after. A pause is thus a moment of potentiality suspended between past and future. Adam, I mean, in a sense, it's what we've been talking about here, but I like the way that you leave that article. It also has a very 2020 feel to it. And I wonder how you feel about those observations now in late 2021.
Well, as we've seen, that there's been not really before and after distinction here. It's been something which has been a lot more of a grey zone. There's been a kind of, there's many little interstices of many different periods of small, activities returning slightly and then stopping again. And I think this is something we're going to have to get used to. I think that's maybe something that that the pause itself isn't going to be this thing that defines this period. Rather, it's going to be a series of pauses, again, felt very unequally by different groups around the world as the virus reaches levels of prominence in different areas, different geographies. So I think maybe that would be my main reflection there, that we maybe need to rethink that as a simple, period in which change happened. I mean, that's something we were also trying to think through the pause as this productive thing, maybe rethinking it through the work that we were really kind of moved by this comment of Arundhati Roy said that we should think of the pandemic as a portal rather than a pause. That's a phrase that's gained a lot of traction, that rather this is an opportunity to rethink some of the injustices and the structural issues that are causing the unequal experience of this time. Sorry, I'll maybe stop there. That's my main reflection.
Thank you for that. And just on the way out, I want to give a chance, Jonathan, another project you both are working on, the Digital Ecologies Research Group. Tell us what this is.
Yeah, so this, again, kind of, we saw the intensification of digital technologies in both wildlife observation and in general kind of domestic life during the pandemic. And we'd been interested in these things before because I'd done some work with people GPS tracking wolves in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And I was really interested in how these technologies mediate various human-animal interactions and kind of, have often been seen as a disconnection. But I was trying to read them as a new novel form of connection. And during the pandemic, and we were doing this research and tuning into these peregrine nest cams and other nest cams, and we visited all of these animal sanctuaries digitally. We did a virtual tour of the Chernobyl exclusion zone to see the dogs that live there. All of these things that we were doing virtually, llamas, going to llama farms and things like this. All of these human-animal relations were digitized during the pandemic, and it was just fascinating. And so it gave birth to this kind of collective project, which is with Adam, Henry Anderson Elliott, Oscar Hartman Davies, Pauline Chesseray-Porali, and Jenny Dodsworth, who are all early career researchers. And we put together a conference, and it attracted quite a lot of attention and had some fantastic papers from all around the world, various instances in which non-humans are being digitized for different purposes. And so we ran this conference, and then we're currently putting an edited collection together on the back of that conference with some of the speakers. We're working on writing a kind of reviewy kind of paper that summarizes and points to future directions, and embarking on various projects to do with digitization in the non-human world. So people are welcome to get in touch. We have a blog. We're always looking for new people to post on the blog. So yeah, thanks for asking that.
I put the link up, www.digicologies, digicologies.com, www.digicologies.com, and check out that work. So just want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls, and this has been one of those weeks on COVID Calls where I just learned so much. And to finish this way is just an honor to speak to you both, Adam Searle and Jonathan Turnbull. And I cannot wait for us to get a chance to have you come to South Korea and come to the DMZ and see the kind of research that's going on there. And some of my colleagues here at KAIST, Bumsun Park and Myung-Ae Choi, who are working on crane populations there, and Joel Champelet is working on that as well. So we got a lively community of people who are engaged in this kind of work here, and I want to connect those dots after we get off the call. So thank you for that. So again, just reminding everyone that, oh, Adam's telling me they're actually in the digital ecology. Of course they are. They're more aware of the world than I am. I'm glad they're involved in that project, and we still need to get you here to make a trip to the DMZ if you haven't been and see that field site. So just reminding everyone that you can catch COVID Calls most weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and today was a special COVID Calls at 5:30 p.m. Korea time. And thanking my guests again, Adam Searle and Jonathan Turnbull. Thanks for the work you're doing. Keep it up. Looking forward to this book, and stay healthy.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all next time on COVID Calls.